Hey, glad you're back here. Fear, friction, and the fight we avoid. Yes, that's what I'm going to talk about today. The subject that we all know and experience, and none of us love: conflict. Leadership today isn't just about scaling, it's about navigating constant uncertainty, market disruptions, and high pressure decisions. If you're dealing with chaos, bottlenecks, and relentless pressure, welcome to the Business Emergency Room. Why conflict derails growing businesses specifically? If we talk in the context of a business emergency room, then I would say that this is an affliction we all suffer frequently. So it's a subject that's relevant to all of us. And I think in the environment that most of us operate, the occurrence or the frequency is even higher. And so a subject worth talking about specifically because it appears to be so hard to talk about and deal with. Well, my core belief is that conflict is seated in fear, almost all of it. People in the workplace experience fear of becoming obsolete, fear of losing influence, fear of being misunderstood, fear of change, fear of irrelevance, fear of failure. And that's not just personal failure. That can also be fear of the business failing or fear of losing their investment. And if that's true, and I believe it is, that fear is the root cause of almost all conflict, then that also means that most conflict potentially is resolvable, but only if we choose to address it instead of avoiding it, which is what most of us do, right? So why does this matter? Well, while you're operating in a volatile market or scaling fast, you're not just more likely to encounter conflict, you're almost guaranteed to. It's part of growing pains. It's part of high stakes. It's part of lots of change. It's part of more unexpected, more surprises of any kind. It's part of situations where there is more stress and pressure. And it causes real damage because if you have conflict in your organization or within the leadership only, which I doubt it's restricted to there. But what happens is that collaboration drops and that communication freezes, that engagement plummets, and ultimately performance suffers. So think about, what do you do? Well, I know for a fact that when I have a conflict with somebody, I start to avoid them. Very few of us find joy in actually facing conflict head on. And maybe don't even call it conflict then if that's what you enjoy. If you really believe that you're in conflict with somebody, you believe that you cannot collaborate with them, you believe that you're better off not being around each other, you don't trust them, you are hurt and maybe making decisions from that hurt rather than what's the wisest in the moment. It's sometimes really hard to adult in those situations. And so, I've seen unresolved conflict in my own life, but also especially in business, lead to full-on business emergencies. I've also seen dealing with conflict and actually having the hard conversations lead to real breakthroughs and about faces and resolving some major challenges that organizations were facing by actually dealing with the conflict. So let's start with a personal example. I have definitely experienced plenty of conflict in the workplace personally, and even more so around me. This is an example from only just probably 6 to 9 months into the job. It was my first full-time job after grad school, but I worked with the company already on a graduation project. So I'd been in the organization a little longer, but not necessarily as an employee before. And the company had gone through a merger a while ago, but they were finally practically integrating the organizations. That usually takes a bit of time. And the reason they'd hired me is that I was actually brought on to implement the plan that I had developed as a student. And that plan included the setup of a new business unit. And so there was a position being created around this plan as part of the restructuring or the reorganization in the merger. And there was a leadership role there in the new business unit. and I got it, which is, of course, very exciting and very special. However, there was someone from the other side of the merger, significantly older, think probably 3 decades, and more experienced, who felt that they deserved the job. But once the announcement was made, that was, what we were going to live with. And everything changed because the reality was we were now on the same team and I was his manager. Safe to say that all of us can imagine that that was not an easy situation at all. He couldn't be let go due to his role on the staff council. So his fear wasn't about job loss. In hindsight, I think his fear was about becoming obsolete. And so he fought me every step of the way. And he acted out of being hurt for being passed over. And I also didn't necessarily avoid the conflict because I wanted to succeed in that first major position. And I had, of course, very limited leadership experience. So I probably wasn't equipped to deal very effectively with all the emotions and feelings he was experiencing. And so, yeah, it became a major inefficiency. So damage done. He lost time and we lost time and performance and trust, and that our entire business unit actually suffered and would have gotten off the ground way sooner than it did. But I do think the conflict didn't continue because by then he had realized the position wasn't what he wanted. And so potentially the conflict could have been avoided or could have dealt with. Moral of the story is conflict is everywhere and it's very costly. So let's zoom out. Conflict between the C-suite and the board is one of the top predictors of failure after Series B. We all know the numbers about how many leaders who've been with the company from the start get forcefully worked out within 4 to 5 years. That's 3/4, right? 3/4 that leave are forced out of those positions, and 80% of them are changing out. So very few go on their own of their own free will out of those positions. And so, yeah, conflict is definitely a major player in that. HR leaders also say that 80% or that 80% 80% of HR leaders say that conflict increases during periods of uncertainty and volatility. So yeah, our normal space of operation. And 1 in 4 employees say they underperform because of conflict. So 1 in 4 are currently experiencing some form of conflict in the workplace, which means that they are not fully engaging with a certain colleague or team or department or collaborating in the way as intended. It's a given that conflict will show up. I'm not going to say that we can avoid it altogether, but it's shocking how rarely we choose to address it on purpose. So how do we deal with it? Not addressing it will, just like drifting, eventually cost you more when the situation resolves itself by somebody leaving, to then claw back all the space and the time you've lost and the inefficiency you've lost might be too late. I'm not sure your business can afford it. And if you learn to deal with conflict, I think you're set up so much better to deal with the market volatility because the uncertainty doesn't go away. Uncertainty is a major contributor to conflict. And let's talk about it as part of my 3-part framework that I want to pitch to you for dealing with conflict in the workplace. And it's the 3 C's: communication, talk, clarity, and care. Let's start with talk. If you think of conflict as a big black cloud that exists over 2 people or over 2 teams or maybe even a group of people, well, that big black cloud thrives in silence. So the first thing you need to do when you realize that there's a conflict in your organization is that you need to talk. You need to get the relevant people in the room, and maybe you need an independent facilitator, or maybe you need a mediator, especially at leadership level, because you need somebody there who is trusted by both sides to be independent. And so if you're from within the organization, you might not always have or be best placed to facilitate that conversation. But you cannot resolve what you won't surface, right? So, and more often than not, what really comes out of this first conversation is that the actual disagreement is much smaller than it seems. So the reason I want you to start with communication or with talking is to actually unearth how both people describe the situation. Because what happens very often is that you can distill then from that the emotions, the assumptions, and the fear. You're not just unpacking the facts. You're letting these people express what the conflict has cost them. And that expression matters because it's not just about winning the argument, but also about being seen and being heard and creating the space to say that. And at least getting off your chest as the situation has affected you. On a much more practical level, in my experience in these conversations, the dark cloud reduces in size very quickly. Not just because even if parties are a little too raw to really acknowledge, like, oh, I see or I know or understand that this caused you pain or a lot of stress, even if in that moment they're not able to say that, the fact that if I'm hurt and I say that to the person who hurt me, because it feels like hurt, and I know they actually heard it, they actually were able to absorb it, and I can see that, even if they don't acknowledge it, that somehow makes it better or smaller already. On top of that, the real win is in unraveling all this misalignment, because inevitably when you have a conversation like that, what you start to see is that people had assumed different things regarding a same situation. So very often in the business environment, the perceived risk or the fear associated with the subject is very different on both sides, and they come at it from completely different angles. And so if you then have the conversation and it turns out that I don't like this situation and the way you're dealing it because I'm afraid of X, but I then realize that you totally think you should push through this situation because you are actually afraid if we don't of Y or Z. I start to realize that potentially my conflict is not necessarily with you. And it becomes less personal. Our conflict is about the fact that we look at a situation very differently. And by unpacking that and bringing it down to the facts, we can start to look at what is it actually that we are, really opposed upon. What is it that we really look at from very different angles? And that's the thing that needs working on. Which brings me then to point number 2, the second C, clarity. Because what's happening now is that you've distilled down the problem to the core. You've given everybody space to say and express their views on the situation and their experiences. What you've also probably established is that you're looking at a situation very differently. And so clarity is conflict's worst enemy, because in the case of any unclarity or any unclarity in the workplace, what happens is that we all start to make our own assumptions. So if there's a conflict between 2 department heads, and it turns out that they've interpreted the goals very differently, and so they're working towards different things, and that's why they're at loggerheads, then that's actually quite a simple thing to resolve. Inevitably, after that first conversation, what happens is that we come up with a whole list of things that leadership needs to provide more clarity on. More clarity in regards to roles and responsibilities, more clarity around whose decision it is to make. Sometimes the pencil needs sharpening around the goals or the objectives or the mission, because it was open to interpretation and it clearly was interpreted quite differently, and that led to the conflict. And that's not uncommon, because if you're moving at breakneck speed and you're scaling, roles change, reporting lines blur, decision lines get fuzzy, and everybody's trying to just keep up with what's on their plate and potentially less busy with keeping to check in that they're still on the joint course and can get a little bit tunnel vision, right? So if you're seeing repeated tension, ask yourself, do people have clear roles and goals? Do they know what success looked like together? Um, has leadership truly painted a picture that others can align with? Or, is there other things that people seem to disagree on, or a subject that people seem to argue around all the time? Are people afraid of keeping their jobs, or how the organization will change when we do succeed? And is that something that needs addressing, or is there great disparity between how they're positioned in the organization, for instance? And is that correctly reflected in how they're being treated and how they're being rewarded? Which brings me to the last point, the last C, which is care. Care shows up in two ways. So care to me shows in care for the individuals involved. And that starts with that communication session, that starts with the conversation. Sometimes conflict goes too far, though, and the tensions fester, and there's no road back. So there's no way that individuals can continue to just work together. And that's okay. It's not okay, right? It hurts and it sucks, but it's okay. Because if you're at that point, I think you know and they know. And so then your care needs to be towards dissolving that situation, which means that somebody needs to move on. It can become like a big festering wound, right? When there's that level of disagreement between individuals, everybody around it is suffering along too and almost gets sucked in. So it's such an energy drain. You need a good course of antibiotics to take it out. And in this case, taking it out means that one or both parties might need to go. And so your job as a leader is to care about both people and actually in your business and do this and find a respectful way of doing this and clarifying boundaries or making changes to avoid things sliding down the hill that fast, which means care to me also means building a culture where conflict doesn't need to fester because you are addressing it, because you are having the difficult conversations. So once you've distilled the cloud down to the basics, what is it that really is creating the conflict between individuals? And if clarification has not completely resolved it, then you still need to care enough to have that difficult conversation with both individuals involved or all individuals involved, and hold people accountable to now work through the issues, agree on an aligned way of working forward, and then hold them to it and hold them also accountable to flag if in the end it wasn't workable or it isn't workable. But you don't just leave it there. I want you to actually avoid conflict spiraling out of control that far by having the difficult conversations. Having the difficult conversations about underperformance, having the difficult conversations when the dynamics start to become unhealthy. And right? When the gossiping ramps up, when the negative kind of off the cuff comments at an individual title or towards individuals is starting to increase, when the collaboration between teams isn't where it should be, then yeah, it needs an intervention and it's time to have those conversations. But not only you as a leader, I think you should also train your people in having the hard conversations because, modeling that direct and respectful dialogue is going to actually be key to success. Showing that difficult issues are safe to surface and to discuss, and that you want people to have those conversations and are equipping them to do that, means that they feel trusted. They will feel that as care and being cared for. It also means that they will feel free on all sorts of other fronts to speak up. Because what happens when I have a somewhat out of this world idea that I think could really benefit the business? And I'm not entirely sure of its doability or whatever. That's why I'm feeling it's a little bit out there. But I also think it's good enough to share or at least give some attention. If I feel fear that me bringing it up leads to somebody ridiculing it, or nobody wanted taking it anywhere because it's too far out there and not even want to have the conversation about something that's strange or outlandish, I'm not going to bring it up. That fear that can create conflict is also fear that holds me back from bringing up the good ideas, from bringing up suggestions, from bringing up things that maybe could be changed or should be changed to improve your business. If I see things around me in the workplace that I think could be improved, they might not necessarily, and they don't, and nothing happens. I might say something, but I might not communicate it the clearest, right? I might kind of give this half hint. Trying to test the water, see if somebody gets it and picks up on it. But if nobody then picks up on it, I'm just kind of sitting there. But at the same time, I'm also keep on thinking, oh, this idea, it would make such a difference. And I'm starting to get frustrated with the inefficient way the current system keeps working. So it doesn't lead to disagreement, but it does lead to disgruntlement. And it maybe might show also in the way I behave or disengage, right? So the tools to resolve conflict are tools we all need to practice anytime, but in conflict, I feel particularly in this order. But then back to care, showing your people that you want them to have these conversations and to deal with the difficult. The business world is going to be more difficult from here on out. There's going to be more unexpected, more challenging, more surprises. And the better we're able to have conversations in the moment, acknowledging that we're maybe on all different sides of looking at the risks associated or how scary something is and the fears we feel with it. If we can have those conversations above the table instead of only in our heads, your business will thrive on the back of that, on the energy and the space it creates for people to turn that into, okay, I've got it off my chest. Now, how are we collectively going to address that? So taking it back to my examples and the 3 C's, if anyone in the organization would have had a conversation with both of us or with us separately about the new organizational model, what the jobs actually entailed, much of the damage could have been prevented. I think the way that the positions ultimately were filled totally suited what both of us brought to the table. And so we were in the right roles. There could have been potentially a more elegant solution to the reporting, because it's kind of hard if you've been in business for 35 years and you're reporting to a 26-year-old, something like that, 25-year-old. The optics of the situation tell you that there's something there that needs a bit of work and care. And that, could have prevented us from being dysfunctional together and actually having joy, because we used to collaborate so well because we had such complementary skill sets. So we could have actually had some joy and used our joint energy that was so different yet complementary just to propel that unit forward. And instead, I think we were quite inefficient for a while in getting progress going and getting things done. And I doubt most of the others in that team had the best time being around us either. So yeah, I think I know this approach would totally have worked there too. So it's fear that fuels conflict. And so your job as a leader is to build that safety to address that fear, safety to speak, safety to question, and safety to disagree. I've seen businesses sink because they let tension grow unchecked and they let relationship fester. And I think we've all been in workplaces where there was conflict between individuals, which maybe ultimately by the time it was so unhealthy started to look as real personal disagreement, but probably started around a business related disagreement. And it just went on and on. And we don't want to work around individuals like that. And you don't get the best out of any of us if we have to work under or with or next to somebody who's involved in that kind of level of conflict. So I've seen businesses totally thrive after realignment and after working on getting the skills to be more truth telling and have more direct conversations. That's a skill that builds business resilience. And that's the work that you need to do. It's not just a soft skill, it's a survival skill, in short. So if you're seeing signs of tension, disconnection, or avoidance in your team, don't wait. If you know that there's already a situation that actually needs addressing, start having those difficult conversations, because that's exactly what will lead you to the first step of recovery from this. Thanks for tuning in today. I hope you put this to use as soon as possible, because I'm sure there's a conflict in your environment that you could test this on today. That's your challenge for this week. Looking forward to having you back here next week. Thank you so much, all. If decision making in your business feels like a never-ending battle, join my free live webinar, Decision Making Mechanics to Turn Chaos Around. It happens every third Tuesday at 2 p.m. Central. We'll tackle the real obstacles slowing you down. Register at thechaosgamesconsulting.com.